Okay, so good afternoon, class. And at this point, what I want to do is to tie up what we've been doing for about the last 3 weeks. And we began this particular novel meeting a whole number of characters, and we were introduced to a number of different voices that they're singing and they're dancing the way through this book, participating in. And what happened is that they began at the beginning. We were introduced to 2 characters, and then to 3, and then to 4, and then to 5, and then to a multitude of other characters as we proceeded. And many of these characters were of minor importance, and some were of major importance. And of course, with the book title being Fifth Business, 5 of them were of absolute, paramount significance in this novel. And they merged their way, and they danced, and they sang their way through a number of interesting events that proceeded as the novel went from point A to B to C to D, etc. And then interestingly enough, and I'm not totally sure you caught this, but they all came together for one moment at the end, unbeknownst to some of them. And not even everybody was alive, but surprisingly, they all came together at a particular point, culminating in the final major act of drama in this, if you will, tragic opera. And then at that point, it left us perhaps with a few questions as to what exactly had just transpired, because perhaps we were overwhelmed by everything we had just been seeing and reading. And maybe we were able to put it all together in our mind and come to a conclusion as to exactly what had taken place. And maybe we weren't. Maybe we were left with some questions as to what did I just read? What actually just happened? So my objective is going to be to tie up the main threads and answer some of the questions that have been arising. Even across the road, people were saying, well, did so do such and such, or what particularly happened? And I'll even begin with that as a beginning question. I need to start with the question asked by David Staunton, who was in the Royal Alexandra Theatre, drunk, and he called out, who killed Boy Staunton? And that's the question that I need to answer. So I'm going to pose it first. Before I proceed to answer it, I'll pose it to you guys. Who killed Boy Staunton? Mike?
I would say like the close characters in his life, so like maybe his wife, his previous wife, his current wife, or son as well.
Okay, well done. What does anybody else think?
The culmination of everything that he's done in his life.
It all came together.
In a literal sense, he was murdered by Eisenberg.
Okay, let's.
This was something we were discussing earlier.
Exactly. I'm glad you were, in fact. Okay, so Eisengrim had a role in it. Spit out names if you don't mind. Who else may or may not, in your opinion?
Dunny bringing up the snowball might have actually had a purpose.
So Dunny with the bringing up the snowball in the conversation kind of prompted the entire evening's events to take place, because it was on the ride home from that meeting in Dunny's room that something odd happens by the Toronto Harbourfront, and Boy's Cadillac ends up 20 feet off the dock in the water, sinking in the frigid, frozen waters of Lake Ontario with Boy in the Cadillac with a stone in his mouth and his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that when they rescue the car, his hands have to be pried from the steering wheel, which indicates that he kind of wanted to be there. When he died, he sort of wanted to be there. He wasn't opening the window. He wasn't trying to get out through the door. He wasn't trying to save himself. In some way, it would appear that Boy was content to be where he was when he died, which is really odd. We're going to do a little bit of a review. I'll do it very quickly. If you take your books for a second and you go to page 227, and I'll review what I did with you the other day on 227, beginning in the 3rd paragraph, where Liesel and Dunny are having a pre-shake hands with the devil conversation. And Liesel says, well, with the operas and the companies that we have in Europe, you always have to have a soprano, and a tenor, and a contralto, and a bass, and a baritone. So let's just run this through on the board for a second. So we always have to have, we need to have a tenor, and we need to have a contralto, and then we move, we have to have a soprano, and then we have to have a basso, and then a baritone. And she makes a pretty good line in the second or third last paragraph. She says, fifth business is a pretty good role to have, she says. Fifth business is the one who knows the secret of the hero's birth, or perhaps assisted the heroine, or perhaps took care of her in her cell, you know, and so in some way, fifth business knows the parts of the plot that nobody else is aware of, and on top of that, fifth business makes it all happen and brings it to an end at the culmination. So she says to Dunny, are you fifth business? You better find out. And she says it's a good role because it often outlasts all the golden voices. So he needs now to find out who is who. So finally we can get to the point where we have now read the entire book, so we can assign a character from the novel to each of these. And because you guys are familiar with this, you're going to tell me right off the bat that the tenor is? So the tenor is boy. Who's the contralto? So say it again?
No.
Yeah, I'm going to come back. I'll come back. I want you to think about the soprano now. It's going to be Mary. It's going to be Mary Dempster. And the bass is going to be? It's going to be Magnus, because he's also going to be the villain. And the basso always gets the villainous sounding deep voice in the opera. And the baritone is going to be, of course, he's going to be Dunny. So I still want to see if we can get this one. It's going to be Denise. Yeah, I'm going to explain why. All right. First, though, let's see if we've all got the characters' archetypes straight in our mind. And we know from previous discussion that Carl Jung said that we all kind of function in the shadow of various archetypes who have gone before us and who still exist in the present. And as a result, many of us will identify with a particular type of personality, which could almost be said to be immortal because it's always existed and perhaps always will. So let's run through the archetype of boy.
The businessman?
Okay, that is an archetype today. It is. But in the novel, how is it explicitly stated?
He's the village prince?
Yeah, we could say he was called the rich young ruler by Paul, but essentially, as we were saying, that means like the prince of the village. Okay? So I'm going to say ruler / prince. And I mean, if his father was the man who had the money and the power and passed it on to him, well, that was sort of like a princely inheritance, from which he then built his own monumental fortune, of course. Are you ready to tell me who this particular archetype would be? That's not a bad one. I'm going to take it just a slightly different direction, though. It's often given a French connotation. Femme fatale. Right? Now, the deadly woman. Now, firstly, apologies for the fact that it always sounds like a bit of a sexist term, you know, that there are women who exist to sort of destroy and kill good men. And in fact, you know, many women find Davies difficult to read because they find his worldview somewhat traditional and dated, in fact. But in this particular, rendering that we've been making our way through, Denise, singing contralto, is going to be the deadly woman. And we're going to come back to that in a second and take a look at how and why that is the case. Moving on, the archetype for Mary is going to be the feminine divine. We could also say that she's the goddess figure, perhaps. She's also divine mercy. So she has a number of different roles that she's been portraying. Who is going to be our archetype next? It's the magician. I mean, from Merlin to Houdini, like we've always had a desire to observe these workers of wonders in their element. So absolutely, the magician is an archetype. And Paul was very clear that his rendering of this archetype was going to be portraying a sinister form of magicianship. It wasn't going to be a friendly, cuddly, lovable magician, an entertainer. He wants to put a sinister sort of thrill into your spine and make you kind of conceive of the underworld, and hence the sort of Faustian overtones that enter into a number of the stage acts that he carries out. And of course, there's Dunny, the main character. What do you think we're going to say his archetype is? Yeah, I would go with definitely. I'm going to say confidant. And many people will say fifth business, but you know, technically speaking, fifth business is probably more of an operatic term or a theater term than it is a psychological archetype. Although I certainly understand why people would say that, you know, it's the role, perhaps the archetype he plays, but best for our purposes would be to call him the confidant of essentially, you know, the hero. Well, he's a tragi-hero, and he's even an anti-hero, but he's the confidant of Boy. All right. So the next thing I need to look at would be the types of death that might have taken place. Because you called out several names. When I said who killed Boy Staunton, when I repeated David Staunton's question, essentially, who killed my father, you know, he received the possibility of different answers to that question. And we've got some of these different possibilities up on the board. So would you be able to give me an idea as to what type of killing actually transpired? You want to start me out?
Physically, I'd say it was just plain suicide.
Okay, let's go with the suicide. I can buy that. Okay. Diego.
The suicide was induced by hypnosis.
Okay. So, tell me, what did he commit?
Well, I mean, manslaughter.
Manslaughter.
Isn't that what it is?
Yeah.
I'd even push it.
First degree murder.
I would.
It couldn't be first degree. It can't be first.
I'm going to call it murder. I am going to call it murder.
First. No.
Manslaughter was
But first.
Manslaughter is accidental. There was nothing accidental about the fact that Paul stole the stone, carried out an act of hypnosis, and sent the guy off to die in the waters. Now, you probably couldn't get a first-degree conviction on that.
It would probably be second or third.
You could get a second. Well, third is an American term for manslaughter. But in Canada, we could get a second-degree conviction on that one.
Because I did not kill him, but you got him to kill him.
Yeah. Okay. Ruben.
As Ingram says earlier in the book that you just can't be used to make someone's murder.
Exactly.
So wouldn't that apply here?
That's what makes this a suicide. Because had he not wanted to die, he couldn't have been hypnotized against his will. But the fact that he wanted to die allowed his latent death wish to be able to be carried out. And that is proven, as I said a second ago, by the fact that his hands were clenchly gripping the steering wheel. He wanted to go. This guy was just fulfilling his latent death wish by allowing his, you know, real deepest, darkest wish to actually be carried out. Now, what other types of death might we have seen? Sorry? I'm gonna throw one out for Dunny, unless you can help me out. I'm going to come back to psychological in just a second. Let me do this a little bit differently, all right? What I'm going to say is that an execution took place. I'm going to say that an execution took place 60 years after the crime. And that was the crime of the snowball that had a stone in the middle that hit Mary in the head and basically, to some degree or another, knocked out an aspect of her wits and her ability to get by in life semi-competently, and precipitated the death of the child 80 days before he was due, and led to the destruction of the family and the destruction of the reputations, and Paul's mistreatment at the hands of the wild man, Le Solitaire, after the fact. So I think, to some extent, there was an execution that took place 60 years after a crime had occurred. And then finally, back to what Brian was saying, I want to bring in the psychological element. And what I would then go on to say is that psychologically, there was a psychological suicide that took place. It's a psychological suicide, and you might even say, you could make the case that it was also a spiritual suicide as well. So now we've got the 5 different types of deaths. And so now we're going to go to our books, and we're going to run through just some of the key passages.
Well, Mary just died.
This was necessary expiation. Thank you. This was, what does it mean to make expiation? Essentially, it means to pay penance for a crime committed. And the crime committed had to do with the fact that Boy never acknowledged what he had done to marry throughout his entire life. Initially, he threatened Dunny with probably physical harm when they were boys, if Dunny should ever tell anybody as to what had happened. But later on in life, he claimed to have forgotten it, because he said, I never remember things that aren't important to me. But tell me, can you actually do that? Can you actually decide to forget something? So the best I can do is to give Boyd the benefit of the doubt and say that he buried it in his unconscious, meaning perhaps he was able to forget about it at the level of his conscious thinking, but there is no way that that act simply disappeared. So if nothing else, it went below the surface into his unconscious and resided there. And so as a result, he still needed to pay that price.
Doesn't penance have divine connotations, which fits in with Mary's will?
In a Catholic context, it does have a religious connotation, that you're making expiation for sin or for offense committed against God, against your fellow man. And perhaps Boyd needed to do penance on that count as well, for that reason. Now the next thing I wanted to look at is go to the very last page, if you will, of the book. This is going to be page 266. And we're going to try and tie up some more items that arise at this point. Look at the third paragraph. Liesel answering David Staunton says, he was killed by the usual cabal. Well, a cabal is a sinister conspiracy engaged in an act of malevolence. It never has positive connotations associated with it. It's a word that always has negative undertones. And so, as she says, he was killed by the usual cabal, by himself. Suicide, first of all. So she's saying that Boy committed a suicide, because for whatever reason, he had reached the end of what he could basically stomach in his life. Now, what I want you to do is, for a second, go to page 252, and I'll read a short section for you very quickly, which will try to make this point. 252, halfway down the page. Why would the president of Alpha Corporation, a man notably youthful in appearance and outlook, and one of the 2 or 3 richest men in Canada, want to kill himself? His home life was of model character. He and his wife, former Denise Hornick, a figure of note in her own right as an advocate of economic and legal reform on behalf of women, had worked closely in a score of philanthropic and cultural projects. Besides, the newspapers thought it now proper to reveal his appointment by the Crown to the office of Lieutenant Governor. Why was a man with Boy Staunton's high concept of service likely to have killed himself under such circumstances? Well, this is interesting. It wasn't enough. Everything that he had did not satisfy him. And Dunny makes reference to that at the end of the book when he said, those who eat sweets at breakfast are cloyed by noontime. Now think about that. To be cloyed means to be sickened. So those who eat sweets at breakfast, well, Boy ate sweets throughout his youth and throughout his middle years. But Dunny goes on, he says they're cloyed, meaning they're sickened by lunch. So what it means is that Boy had too much of the good stuff too early, and it wasn't enough, it didn't satisfy him, and as he approached old age, there was nothing positive to look forward to. It was all going to be a long, slow road downhill that he didn't want to travel. He wasn't going to be happy with that. Now, the next section that I'm going to take a look at is going to be back to the quote on page 266. And Liesel continues, and she says that he was killed by himself, but then by the woman that he knew. The woman that he knew. And I'm going to say that the woman that he knew was Denise. And in terms of how did she kill him, well, I've already made reference on the board to the fact that she indirectly or directly contributed to his psychological or his spiritual suicide. And to make that point, I'm going to take it firstly to page 234. And what I need to do at this point is to simply talk about this second marriage that Boy undertakes to enter. And so he meets Denise, and he keeps on making the point that she had a masculine mind on 234. She had a masculine mind. She had a masculine mind. And a fourth time on page 237, she had a masculine mind. Well, what's the point of that? Think back to Friday. What did I tell you that according to Carl Gustav Jung, what is the